Where was Abraham Lincoln born? Well, the history books we all read in school tell us Kentucky. A lot of people, including some historians, though, question whether that is true.
To understand why this story matters, you first need to understand the world that Nancy Hanks entered when she was born, sometime around 1784, in what is now Mineral County, West Virginia. This was not a forgiving world. It was a world with rigid legal and social hierarchies that sorted human beings into categories of worth and worthlessness almost from the moment of birth. In 18th and early 19th century America, children born outside of marriage occupied a uniquely brutal legal position. English common law, which formed the backbone of colonial American jurisprudence, classified such children under the Latin term filius nullius, meaning nobody's child. This was not merely a social label. It was a legal designation with serious material consequences. A child born outside wedlock had no right to inherit from their father. They had no automatic claim to family name, property, or social standing. In the eyes of the law, they were legal ghosts, existing in society, but possessing none of its protections or privileges. The name they carried was their mother's name, because under common law, the father of an illegitimate child was simply not recognized, regardless of who he actually was. For mothers, the situation was equally severe. Unmarried women who gave birth faced potential criminal prosecution in many colonial jurisdictions. Public records from counties across Virginia, Kentucky, and the broader frontier confirmed that women were dragged before grand juries and charged with fornication, a crime whose primary evidence was the existence of the child itself. Convicted women faced fines, sentences in houses of correction, and in some cases, public humiliation designed to enforce social norms. Even after formal punishments were served, the stigma remained. Families constructed elaborate fictions to hide illegitimate children from neighbors, raising them as cousins, nieces, or nephews rather than speak openly about circumstances that could destroy reputations for generations. In the political arena, illegitimacy functioned as a loaded weapon. Enemies of a public figure would use such information to question his moral character, attack his fitness for office, and undermine public confidence in his leadership. A man whose own origins were tangled in illegitimacy was considered tainted, regardless of his personal accomplishments. This was the world Abraham Lincoln navigated. And he navigated it with remarkable deliberateness. Around 1850, Abraham Lincoln was riding with his close law partner, William H. Herndon, on their way to court in Menard County, Illinois. During that journey, Lincoln said something he had almost certainly never said aloud to anyone before and would never say again publicly. According to Herndon's own account, Lincoln told him words to this effect, that his mother was a bastard, the daughter of a Virginia nobleman whose name was never recorded, and that he believed his own intellectual gifts, his analytical mind, his ambition, his drive, all came from this mysterious and unidentified paternal grandfather on his mother's side. Then Lincoln added the words that would echo across time. "God bless my mother," he said. "All that I am or ever hope to be, I owe to her." What the documentary record did preserve was damaging enough to sustain the debate for over a century. Deep in the archives of Mercer County, Kentucky, researchers uncovered a document dated November 24, 1789. It recorded the indictment of a woman named Lucy Hanks by a grand jury on a charge of fornication. In the legal context of late 18th century Kentucky, this charge carried a specific meaning. An unmarried woman had given birth to a child outside of wedlock. The child's existence was itself the evidence. The timeline aligned with remarkable precision. If Nancy Hanks, Lincoln's mother, was born around 1784, she predated any recorded marriage involving Lucy Hanks. Lucy's marriage to a man named Henry Sparrow did not occur until April 30, 1790, and a note in Lucy's own handwriting giving consent for that marriage was written just weeks before the ceremony. What is particularly striking about that note, which still survives today, is its urgency. Lucy wrote it herself, acknowledging she was of legal age and freely consenting to the marriage. Within a month of that marriage, the fornication charges against her were formally dropped. Marriage had restored her respectability in the eyes of the law and community. But Nancy, who carried the Hanks surname throughout her childhood, was not erased from the story of what came before. Under the conventions of common law, she bore her mother's maiden name precisely because no legal father existed to give her his. She was the living record of what the law refused to legitimize. For over a century, historians fought bitterly over the interpretation of this evidence. One camp, following Herndon's lead, concluded that Nancy Hanks was indeed born illegitimately to Lucy Hanks before any marriage occurred. The opposing camp, led by Kentucky researcher Lewis Warren, argued that Lucy Hanks was actually Lucy Shipley, a woman from a respectable family, and that the entire illegitimacy narrative was a fabrication built on misidentified records. Warren declared confidently in 1941 that characterizing Lincoln's mother as illegitimate was simply another of what he called the Herndon myths. Neither side could deliver a definitive blow. Paper records from the backcountry frontier were too sparse, too easily misread, and too frequently lost. The argument consumed careers and produced far more heat than light. What the argument needed was something that didn't exist in 1889 or 1941. It needed genetics. In 2015, a team of genetic genealogists assembled specifically to settle this debate once and for all. The researchers, including Suzanne Holstrom, Nancy Rise, Stephen Whitlock, Richard Heilman, and Gerald Haslam, represented decades of combined expertise in Hanks' family genealogy. Richard Heilman alone had spent more than 3 decades combing through records at institutions including the Allen County Public Library, the University of Chicago, and the Library of Congress. These were not amateur enthusiasts. These were serious researchers who understood both the genealogical history and the stakes involved. Their scientific instrument of choice was mitochondrial DNA, commonly referred to as mtDNA. This form of genetic material is passed exclusively from mother to child through an unbroken female line. Unlike the DNA in cell nuclei, which blends contributions from both parents in every generation, mitochondrial DNA does not recombine. It is inherited intact, mother to daughter, across unlimited generations. A woman alive today can carry the identical mitochondrial DNA sequence as a maternal ancestor who lived 500 years ago, or 1,000 years ago. This made it the perfect tool for tracing Lincoln's maternal lineage, even the complete absence of Lincoln's own direct descendants. Abraham Lincoln's last confirmed direct descendant, Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith, died in 1985, leaving no children. The Lincoln bloodline, through the direct male line, is biologically extinct. But that did not matter for this study, because mtDNA traces the maternal line. The researchers needed living descendants of any woman who shared the same maternal ancestry as Nancy Hanks Lincoln, which meant daughters, granddaughters, and great-granddaughters through multiple branches of the Hanks family tree. The researchers identified 2 distinct groups for testing. The first group consisted of living female line descendants traceable back to Anne Lee Hanks, who was Lucy Hanks's mother and Nancy Hanks's maternal grandmother. If the traditional Herndon account was correct, and Lucy was genuinely a Hanks by birth, all descendants in this group should share identical mitochondrial DNA. The second group consisted of descendants of the Shipley sisters, specifically Rachel and Naomi Shipley, whose family Warren had argued was Lucy's actual family of origin. If Warren's competing theory was correct, the Shipley descendants and the Hanks descendants should share the same maternal genetic signature. The laboratory analysis was conducted by Gene in Houston, Texas. The results were formally announced on October 21, 2015, timed to mark the 150th anniversary of significant Lincoln-era commemorations. What those results revealed ended the debate that historians had been waging for 126 years. Every single descendant in the first group, those tracing their maternal line back through the Hanks family, carried identical mitochondrial DNA. Every one of them belonged to the same haplogroup, a rare designation that the researchers had not anticipated finding. The second group, the Shipley descendants, carried entirely different mitochondrial DNA. The 2 groups shared no common maternal ancestor within any historically meaningful time frame. The Shipley theory, Lewis Warren's confident assertion that had challenged Herndon for decades, was genetically demolished. Lucy Hanks was a Hanks by birth. Nancy Hanks Lincoln was the illegitimate daughter of Lucy Hanks and an unknown father, exactly as Abraham Lincoln had whispered to William Herndon on that buggy ride more than 170 years earlier. Lincoln had been right all along. But the researchers found something else inside the DNA results, something that stopped them cold and sent them back to verify their data before they could speak about it publicly. Among all the haplogroups they might have expected to find in a family with roots in colonial Virginia, what they found instead was haplogroup X1c. To understand why this matters, a brief explanation of haplogroups is necessary. Mitochondrial DNA haplogroups are essentially genetic timestamps. As human populations migrated out of Africa over tens of thousands of years, random mutations accumulated in their mitochondrial DNA. These mutations allow geneticists to identify distinct population lineages and trace their geographic movements across millennia. Most Americans with colonial European ancestry carry haplogroups common to Northern and Western Europe, designations such as H, J, T, U, or K. Haplogroup H alone accounts for roughly 45% of all European mitochondrial lineages. These are the genetic signatures you would expect to find in a colonial Virginia family with English or Scots-Irish roots. Haplogroup X is different. The X lineage split into two major branches approximately 20,000 years ago during the period of the last ice age. One branch, X2, spread into Europe, the Caucasus, and somewhat famously into certain Native American populations through early migration across what is now the Bering Strait region. X2 represents perhaps 2% of European mitochondrial lineages, making it uncommon but not shocking to encounter. The other branch, X1, took a completely different geographic path. X1 is concentrated primarily in North Africa, the Horn of Africa, the Near East, and the Eastern Mediterranean world. It is not a Northern European lineage. It is not a British Isles lineage. Its highest population concentration anywhere on Earth is found among the Druze communities of modern Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, where it can reach frequencies of up to 27% of the population. Geneticists who study the Druze believe their relative geographic and social isolation has preserved ancient Near Eastern genetic lineages that were once distributed across a much broader region of the ancient world. X1c is a subclade, a specific branch, of the X1 lineage. It is among the rarest mitochondrial signatures found in people with documented colonial American ancestry. The researchers noted in their analysis that this very rarity actually strengthened the reliability of their conclusions. When you find the same rare genetic signature across multiple independent descendants of the same family, the statistical probability that this represents a genuine shared ancestry is extraordinarily high. Finding haplogroup X1c among multiple Hanks line descendants confirmed, beyond any reasonable scientific doubt, that they were all tracing the same maternal line. What this means for the broader narrative of Lincoln's ancestry is significant, though it requires careful interpretation. Haplogroup X1c does not point to anything recent. It does not suggest a scandal in colonial Virginia. It does not identify Nancy Hanks's unknown father or explain anything about the generations immediately before or after Lincoln's birth. What it does is reach far deeper into the past, into the ancient population movements that shaped the human genetic landscape of the Mediterranean world and North Africa long before European colonization of America was even imaginable. At some point, centuries or perhaps more than a millennium before Nancy Hanks was born in 1784, the maternal line of the Hanks family carried this ancient Near Eastern or North African genetic signature westward into Europe and eventually into the colonial American frontier. The precise path of that migration cannot be reconstructed from the DNA alone. What can be said is that the comfortable mythology of pure Anglo-Saxon or British colonial bloodlines, the fiction that American founding families were genetically homogeneous and exclusively Northern European in origin, was always exactly that, a fiction. A story told by people who wished it were true because it served their social and political purposes. The DNA of Lincoln's own maternal ancestry quietly contradicted that story. It is easy, in the excitement of genetic discoveries and historical debates, to lose sight of Nancy Hanks as an actual human being rather than a genealogical puzzle. She deserves better than that. She was born on the rough edges of the American frontier at a time when that frontier offered almost no safety net to families already living on the margins. She grew up without her mother in her household, raised instead by her maternal grandparents, Joseph and Lee Hanks. When Joseph Hanks died around 1793, 9-year-old Nancy was taken in by her Aunt Elizabeth and Elizabeth's husband, Thomas Sparrow. She was known during her childhood years as Nancy Sparrow, which added further confusion to the historical record. She was not the only illegitimate child in that household. Alongside her, Elizabeth and Thomas Sparrow also raised Dennis Hanks, born in 1799 to another of Lucy's younger sisters. Illegitimacy wove through this family's history not as an exceptional scandal, but as a recurring reality of frontier life, where social enforcement was weaker, community oversight was thinner, and the consequences of poverty could unravel the most carefully maintained respectability. Despite every disadvantage her circumstances created, by every account that survives, Nancy Hanks grew into someone remarkable. Neighbors and family members who were interviewed decades later consistently described her as intelligent, deeply devout in her religious faith, warm-hearted, and capable. She learned to read at a time when many frontier women did not. She learned needlework. She worked for neighboring families and earned the respect of the community around her. In 1806, she married Thomas Lincoln, a man of modest means and limited formal education. Together they had 3 children, Sarah, Abraham, and a boy named Thomas Jr., who died in infancy. The family moved from Kentucky to Indiana in 1816. 2 years later, a disease called milk sickness swept through their community. Milk sickness is caused by drinking the milk of cows that had grazed on white snakeroot, a plant toxic enough to kill both animals and the people who consumed their contaminated milk. Nobody in 1818 understood this. What they saw was an invisible sickness moving through neighborhoods, taking one family member after another with terrifying efficiency. Elizabeth and Thomas Sparrow, the aunt and uncle who had raised Nancy, died first. Weeks later, Nancy herself fell ill. She was 34 years old. Abraham Lincoln was 9. Heath and his father built her coffin themselves from green lumber and buried her on a hillside near their Indiana homestead. Lincoln's sister Sarah helped nurse her mother in those final days and watched her die. Lincoln carried the memory of that loss for the rest of his life. He also carried the knowledge of what she had been in the eyes of the law. That knowledge informed his understanding of American injustice in ways that were deeply personal, long before he ever argued a legal case or entered political life. The 2015 DNA study confirmed 3 things that history had long struggled to settle. First, it confirmed beyond scientific dispute that Lucy Hanks was a Hanks by maternal birth, not a Shipley as competing theories had long argued. Second, it confirmed that Nancy Hanks Lincoln was indeed born outside of wedlock, exactly as Lincoln himself had confided to Herndon more than a century and a half earlier. Third, it revealed that Lincoln's maternal ancestry carried a rare mitochondrial haplogroup, X1c, most commonly associated with ancient North African and Near Eastern population origins, a finding that no one had predicted and that fundamentally challenges comfortable assumptions about colonial American genetic homogeneity. The disturbing element in all of this is not the ancient DNA. Ancient migration patterns are fascinating, but not troubling. What is disturbing is the human machinery that surrounded these facts. Lucy Hanks was a young woman who became pregnant outside of marriage and was dragged before a grand jury for it. The charge against her was the existence of her daughter. Nancy Hanks spent her entire life carrying the legal designation of nobody's child, a status imposed on her before she was old enough to understand what it meant. Abraham Lincoln, the president who ended slavery and preserved the republic, spent his entire political life quietly terrified that his enemies would discover the truth about his mother and use it to destroy everything he had built. What the DNA ultimately proved was not scandalous. What it proved was human. It proved that a woman's society tried to raised a son who became one of the most consequential human beings of the 19th century. It proved that genetic ancestry is always far more complex and far more interesting than the myths any society builds around it. And it proved that Lincoln knew exactly what he was doing when he said those words that still resonate more than 160 years later. All that I am or ever hope to be, I owe to her. He meant every word. And now, finally, we understand the full weight of what he was saying.